Welcome everybody to a supplement to our recent panel discussion on tips for families as to how to manage lockdown. At the end of that panel discussion, we had a period of questions. There were over 100 questions that we were unable to answer at the end of that panel discussion. So we decided that we would offer a second supplement today to go through those questions in a lot more detail. My name is Professor Sarath Ranganathan, and I'm the Stevenson Chair of Paediatrics at the University of Melbourne. And joining me on this panel to discuss those various questions is Professor David Coghill, who's a Professor of Child and Adolescent Psychiatry, and also Dr. Michael Carr-Gregg, who is a child, adolescent, and family psychologist. So before we commence, I would like to start by acknowledging the traditional owners of the land where I sit, the Wurundjeri people of the Kulin Nation, and I'd like to pay my respects to their elders, past, present, and those emerging. So a little bit more information about what we're trying to do today. It's impossible to go through all those 100 unanswered questions, but we have tackled them by assigning them to various themes. And so it's questions on those themes that I'm going to pose to our two experts, a psychiatrist and a psychologist, to see what specific tips and advice they can give us using their professional expertise. So without further ado, let's start our panel discussion. I think we'll start with the very first question. And this one, I think, will go to David first. One of the very important themes that was brought up was that around anxiety, that families at this very difficult time are experiencing higher than usual levels of anxiety. So I suppose, first of all, are you aware of any resources that are there for families? And also, if there's any advice that you have that people can adopt? And in a second, after your response, I'll also hand that over to Michael. So I think both your professional areas here are going to be very useful.
Thanks, Sarath. Yeah, anxiety has definitely been one of the mental health difficulties that's really increased with the lockdown, and it's understandable why. People are anxious about COVID itself. They're anxious about missing out on activities, on school. They're anxious about what happens when we go back to school. So there are a lot of different reasons why kids and adults as well have become more anxious. You mentioned, are there resources for children and young people? And there certainly are. There are some very good ones. The one that comes first to mind is a program called the BRAVE program. And BRAVE is what we call an evidence-based program for anxiety. There's a BRAVE program aimed at children, and there's a BRAVE program aimed at adolescents. And I've actually sat with quite a few, both children and young people, while they've explored the BRAVE program. And it's actually been very helpful to sit with them, because at the beginning, often they're actually anxious about tackling the program. They're anxious and possibly a bit skeptical. This is an online program. They've been doing online school. They've been doing online everything. And so they're a bit anxious about, what's going to be different? Will this work? But actually, it's a great program that really winds people in and gets them engaged. So that's something that I really would look at. In a less structured way, the BRAVE program really goes through the whole of anxiety. Then one of the things that we do know helps those who are feeling anxious is relaxation and mindfulness techniques. And there again are an awful lot of apps and online programs now, very efficient and effective ones, at helping kids engage in mindfulness, engage in some meditation and relaxation techniques. The one thing I would say, though, is one size doesn't fit all. And I, again, have had experience with children and young people where I've recommended a program that someone else has found very helpful, and they've come back and said, no, that wasn't for me. So sometimes if the first one doesn't work and doesn't help you, it's really important to go out and look for something else, look for the others. There are lots of variations, and just like everything in life, you know, we don't all like the same television programs. We don't all like the same music. We don't all like the same books. One size doesn't fit all for anxiety. There's a lot out there now, and keep looking, because there will be something for you. And the last thing I'd want to say is that our kids are going to need a lot of support doing this, and they're also going to need to know that they're not alone feeling anxious. So one of the other things that really helps to start to, let's say, diffuse the situation, but help people work through the situation, is talking about it. And one of the best ways to help kids talk about it is to acknowledge that you feel the same way yourself sometimes. And so a bit of self-disclosure, a bit of helping them to see how you manage, then can be moved into modeling positivity, being positive, encouraging positivity, rather than getting stuck in a cycle of negativism and optimism for the future. So I think these are the kind of things that parents and children, their children, can engage in to help.
Well, fantastic, comprehensive answer. You've mentioned there's some resources such as Brave, and we need to put that in the links here. That I think that will be very helpful to families. The various variety of resources, and finding something that will personally be attractive to one particular individual, disclosing positivity. Do you have anything to add to those comments and advice from David?
I do. Thanks, Sarath. First of all, there's a third component to the Brave program, which is actually the parent program, and that's particularly useful. So I endorse absolutely what David said. Could I add too that there's a couple of apps that I found that the young people quite enjoy in the service of relaxation. One is called ReachOut Breathe, and it's free, and it uses the camera on your iPhone to pick up your heartbeat. And with quite a clever little program, it actually teaches you, using biofeedback, how to slow your breathing down. And there's a principle in psychology: if you want to sort of calm your breath, you can calm your mind. So that works very well. The other program I'm very fond of, and David mentioned mindfulness, is Smiling Mind. That can almost be like pressing the pause button on the self-talk, the chatter that young people can have. The other thing that I think can work brilliantly is to get, and it's in service again of sharing the thought processes, is to get the young person to write down a worry list. Sometimes just the act of writing down what worries you in order can be enormously useful. Putting the thoughts down on paper, it's sort of a way of diffusing their power a little bit as well. And the other technique that I'm finding great success with at the moment is colouring books. I know that David's big on creativity. The idea of actually colouring, either using a colouring book or actually just taking an ordinary piece of paper and painting or drawing, I think that can be very, very helpful. And the last thing that I'd recommend is a little bit of progressive muscle relaxation. I've got a rather lovely script, which I'll let you have, Sarath, where the young person can imagine that there's a fly on their nose and squeeze up their nose, and then there's one on their chin, and they basically can learn to self-soothe and reduce the levels of anxiety. I think, generally speaking, I would say to parents that one of the keys around anxiety is to try and help them come to terms with what it is that they're anxious about. I think not using avoidance as a coping mechanism, and I'd be interested in David's thoughts on that, but to stay where they are in the anxious moment, maybe do some deep breathing, particularly the smelling a flower and then blowing out a candle. That little technique can work very, very well. We call it the stress breath, but essentially recognizing that when they're very, very anxious, it is temporary. They shouldn't run. What goes up will come down, and that we can actually teach them to manage their anxiety rather than avoid it. David?
Oh, I think that's really, really strong advice. And again, I think it's an area where parents can really get engaged and help. Sometimes even by holding, by cuddling, by being there very physically as well as emotionally for kids, to help them, not to restrain them from moving, but to help them sit with that anxiety. Because you're exactly right that avoidance is a big part of what builds anxiety. It's a big consequence of anxiety, but it's also the way to work back from anxiety. So facing those challenges, but doing it in a graded way. And I was interested about your list. I've often used a staircase or a ladder of, so you write your list, you maybe cut them onto little post-it notes or put them on post-it notes and arrange them in a hierarchy so that you can tackle the easiest ones first, but you can also see how you're progressing up your ladder or up your staircase of difficulty with each challenge, and remembering not to try and tackle the hardest thing first. Leave it. Wait till you've got some confidence in there. So yeah, I think all of those are fantastic ideas, and all of them should be possible for us to do within lockdown, within the current circumstances.
Thanks to you both, because those were great answers. It's a great insight to hear a psychiatrist and a psychologist putting their minds together to find some advice around this. And this is obviously a big problem, anxiety. So it was great to have such a comprehensive response from both of you. Anything in fact, you wanted to say there?
Well, Sarath, I did just want to say one more thing, and it reminded me when you mentioned the psychiatrist that for children and adolescents, unless the anxiety is very severe and very long-standing, medication isn't the answer. And so the psychological therapies are really where we need to go first. Now, for some people, it's been hard to find those, but as Michael was saying, there are available psychological therapies that we can use that you don't need to wait for the psychologist for. And although I'm a psychiatrist, although I do prescribe medications for mental health problems, and I don't have a problem with that, it's not what we should be reaching in the first instance for anxiety. And I think that is an important message for parents to get, because they may well be offered medications. And you know, maybe it will be tempting to say, well, this is the quick and easy approach. But actually, the kind of things that we've been outlining, particularly the things that Michael's outlined, are really the very important first steps.
Michael, you've got a fan in David. That's great to know.
Well, he's got a fan in me. I think the other thing that I just need to mention is the importance of psychoeducation in this area. And both ReachOut, which is a marvellous organisation, reachout.com.au, has got some fantastic evidence-based information around anxiety. And may I also recommend a pamphlet you can download from Beyond Blue called What Works for Anxiety. And it lists all of the various treatments and shows the consumer the evidence base for each one of these particular strategies. So if we could put that in the resources, that would be wonderful as well.
Yeah, we'll do that for sure. So just moving on to one of the other themes that was brought up during our panel discussion, and perhaps it is related to anxiety, so a good thing to follow on. the theme was around people who are mentioning that they're not sleeping well. And they wondered whether that could be related to the lockdown itself, and also any advice on how to tackle poor sleep during the lockdown. Perhaps that one, maybe David, again, you could start with trying to respond to that.
It's a very common problem, and I think people's routines and activity levels have been less. As you say, anxiety and depressed mood can cause difficulties with sleep. But there are many, many other causes. And I think that most people's difficulties are, in a sense, probably multifactorial. If it's anxiety that's causing the difficulty, then of course, going back to what we said for the first question, managing the anxiety will be an important part of getting back to a routine. And the one thing, Michael, we didn't mention, and I'm surprised we didn't mention it in that first answer, was routine. Because actually one of the big things during times like this, when our routines are disrupted and that we know works for anxiety, we know works for low mood, is routine. And for sleep, actually the key is a good bedtime routine. Now, we have a fancy name for that. We call it sleep hygiene, which does, though, really describe what it is that we're thinking about. But it's a positive routine. You avoid daytime naps. You don't stay in bed awake for more than 5 to 10 minutes. So actually getting up when you're awake rather than lying in bed. And then in the evening, restricting drinks with caffeine in them, restricting watching the TV, using the computer, or reading from the iPad in bed is an important one. Having that kind of clean, fresh air and a comfortable bedroom. So really getting these proper sleep routines, but really starting at the right time, starting early enough, but not too early. If child's having difficulty getting to sleep, then one of the things you can do is put the bedtime back a bit, accept that, and then once you get into the routine, pull it back a few minutes, 5-10 minutes every day until you're getting to the right time. One of the things that happens with sleep is that where we fall asleep is where we fall asleep. And so it's very important. That sounds rather obvious, but what we want is we want kids sleeping in their beds. We want them sleeping in the situation that we want them to go back to sleep to if they wake up. So, for example, going to sleep in mum and dad's bed, which I think has become a lot more common over the lockdown, is something that's probably going to continue to cause difficulties. Now, I'm not saying it's never appropriate to do that, but if we want kids to sleep independently, then it's important that they go to sleep independently. Our bodies and our minds learn that sleep situation. Again, I'm not big on medications for sleep. There are some times when it can be helpful, but I'm really keen that we actually use these regular sleep routines, this sleep hygiene. And one of the things I'll put into the chat is a link to Sleep Scotland. Now, I came here from Scotland, and it just happens that Scotland have one of the best voluntary organisations for managing sleep. And even though it's around the other side of the world, Sleep Scotland has some great programmes that people can link into. Michael might know some more local programmes. I'm not up to speed with that. But I think that's my thoughts. Is it's about routine, it's about managing anxiety, and it's about sensible planning.
Thanks, David. I'd have to be convinced that Sleep Scotland doesn't involve whiskey in some way, but perhaps it does. Maybe, Michael, if you could add to David's comments on this. It's obviously an important problem at the best of times, and lockdown must have made things worse for people's sleep patterns.
Yeah, look, I think it's, thanks for that. I think it's thrown the sleep-wake cycle out. I think a lot of people's structure and routine has gone out of the window, and it's a case of you never know what you had until it's gone, and now it's not quite as present in their lives anymore. A lot of my clients are suffering. So my advice is very similar to David's. I think we should try and dim the lights half an hour before we go to bed, because we know that light can be really the enemy of sleep. Going to bed at the same time, in the same place, David's spot on. Most importantly, sleeping in somewhere where it's cool, dark, and quiet. Those three things seem to be important. Not exercising close to bedtime is another important thing. And if I might recommend a TED talk by the very famous British Oxford academic, Professor Russell Foster. He's got a TED talk called Why Do We Sleep? And even though it's about 11 years old now, it's rather brilliant. And if you are interested at all in learning about sleep, he is your man. And he talks about how we're going to spend a third of our life asleep. If we actually live to about 92, he suggests we'll spend about 32 years of our life asleep, and talks about the importance in terms of memory restoration, improving the consolidation of the information that we've acquired. And the conclusion that I've reached is that sleep is actually one of the most important study tools going around. So certainly not something we should skimp on. And I think that's enough from me.
Mm.
Yeah, thank you very much.
The one thing, just to add to that, I think there's a lot of people still don't understand. It's about the light and the way that light can interfere with sleep. And we call it blue light. And blue light comes from television screens, it comes from phones, it comes from computers, and it comes from iPads. And blue light actually turns off the natural sleep hormone, melatonin, in our bodies. So this is the reason. It's not that we want to interfere with people's enjoyment or activities that we say no screen time before bed, but it actually has a biological link to switching off the hormone, the substance that actually tells your body now it's time to sleep. And there are some ways around it, but I think the easiest thing to do is not to use those devices. And if you're going to do something in bed, then certainly you can listen to something peaceful and restive, but also read a book, an old-fashioned book with paper and a light. And actually that's a very good way for many people to start to switch their brains off to start to get into that sleep cycle.
Thanks very much. And before I move on to the next theme, I just want to apologize for the white light that's streaming through into my room. I don't know if you can see that on my Zoom, but the sun unexpectedly has come out and it's creating that lovely stream of white light in my room, which is improving my mood. The next theme that I want to ask you about is the theme of loneliness. And I think this is a really important theme. The theme really here is around how we can manage loneliness. Isn't connecting online just more screen time? Are people during lockdowns much more lonely? How can we self-help in that sort of situation? And what can we do as a society, I suppose? Maybe, Michael, you could start in this theme.
Yeah, look, loneliness has become increasingly on our radar over the last probably 2 decades. And in fact, the UK, a couple of years ago, actually appointed the world's first ever minister for loneliness. Japan appointed one a few weeks ago. And I know that there's a push on in Australia to elevate its status to ministerial level at a federal kind of government level. So what do I think? I think we need to be clear that probably the worst thing for someone with a mental illness, that is that they have problems with their thoughts, their feelings, and behavior that interferes with their day-to-day life. The worst thing for someone like that is in fact loneliness. And one of the difficulties, of course, with lockdowns is that not only are the people who already had, the 1 in 5 Australians, the 1 in 7 children, the 1 in 4 teenagers who already had psychological problems are struggling. There are also now some people for whom the loneliness has created a rich soil in which those mental health problems can arise. So we know from study after study that loneliness is as bad for your physical health as smoking and drinking and not eating the right things. And of course, a key developmental task for both children and adolescents is in fact for children playing with their friends and for teenagers hanging out with their friends. It's a vital part of their emancipation from adult carers and of course their identity formation, which is arguably one of the key tasks of adolescence. So for me, it's a matter of great concern. I think part of the irony of the COVID-19 pandemic has been that for a long time, we demonized social media. And in fact, it has, to a certain extent, proved the salvation for many of my clients, because while they couldn't see one another face to face, they have been able to keep a reasonable level of connectivity and almost thwart their loneliness through online connection. It's not as good as face-to-face contact, particularly not for children, but it'll be a adequate substitute in the meantime. And I'll be really interested to hear David's view.
No, I fully agree with that. I mean, I think one of the things that I was getting worried about a few months ago was that we were only hearing negative things about online activity and reduce, when in actual fact we know that connectivity and its opposite, loneliness, are some of the biggest drivers of a lack of well-being, let's say. It's not just about mental health problems, it's about not being well, not feeling well. And so I think that it is important that we're balanced when we think about that actually there are times when online connectivity, well, one is all we can do if we're in lockdown, if we have quarantine, and it's really challenging, but also that whilst it's not the optimal way to hang out with each other, it is a way. And so I think that we have to give our young people really the opportunity to be able to do that meeting up, to do that hanging out. And it's probably, not that much different from sitting in their bedrooms alone or hanging out down the servo, just hanging out, chatting. When you ask people what are they doing, it is really, it might seem to us low level, but it's very important feeling out and finding out what others are doing. But the other thing, whilst loneliness has been a real problem, the other thing that's really worth pointing out is that the RCH Child Health Poll, which we heard about during our first webinar actually identified that a lot of parents are saying that family connectivity is better from lockdown, not worse. And actually that they've been able to make connections with their children, with their young people, and do things together. And so I think we do have to remember that this is something that actually often we were talking about how society had changed and the family was no longer there as a unit to work with each other. And a lot of people have found that they can get that back. So actually not just focusing on the external connectivity, but thinking about how we can connect as families. What games can we play? What things can we do? And with that, remembering that what worked last week may not work this week. It'd be old and tired to say, go bake some sourdough bread. That was great for us at the beginning, but our tastes and our attitudes and our focus changes, and that will change within families as well. So just because something worked last week, it may not work this week, and we may need to think hard about what we do. And then I think we have to not underestimate how challenging that is for parents. Parents aren't used to, for very good reasons, parenting 24/7. We've had the break for school during the day. We've had the break when our kids go out to play or go for a play date at someone else's. A lot of parents haven't had that now. So it's understandable that people have been feeling challenged, and they need to be able to give themselves some space. I was listening to ABC radio, I think it was this morning or yesterday evening, where a lady came on and said, I bought chooks. And the reason I bought chooks is it's a good excuse. I can go out and have coffee while I collect the eggs and feed the chooks while the kids are doing their online school. So thinking about these little ways where we can actually reward ourselves and give ourselves some space and some time, and remember that others need that as well.
Thanks, David. Some of the things you mentioned require remaining motivated, and anxiety, loneliness, or even poor sleep, they can contribute to a sort of lack of motivation. We discussed something around that in our panel discussion itself. But Michael, can you give some specific tips on how we can motivate ourselves?
Yeah, I think that we also need to name why it is we're not all that motivated. I think there are a lot of people at the moment who are languishing, which is a sort of state of stagnation. They're sort of muddling through their day. It's almost a void between depression and flourishing. It's the absence of well-being, that you don't actually have to have symptoms of mental illness for this. You're just not functioning really at full capacity. And what happens is your motivation really does reduce. There's a sort of focus, concentration deficit, and your commitment to work sort of goes. If you think about a sort of dwindling of drive and a tendency to slip into solitude and become indifferent to your indifference, I think that's a really good way of understanding it. But I said in the original webinar that I thought we needed to work out our why, to figure out what it is that we were doing, whatever it is that we were doing for. Sharing, creating some new goals, sharing them with other people, tracking our progress, and celebrating our success when we gradually move towards whatever it is that we've set ourselves. It almost goes back to David's ladder hierarchy idea, which is, I think, brilliant. But if we can actually set ourselves little achievable goals, share them, track them, and celebrate them, that's a really good start.
Mm. And the other important thing, Michael, is that the trajectory is not always up. there are ups and downs. But one of the things to be, important to remember is that's to be expected. And actually, if everything shoots up to 100%, everything's fine. That's probably quite fragile. But the ups and downs will come. The good thing is if the downs are less and less each time, if we keep going up that staircase.
So how do we stay positive ourselves? And one of the themes was around maintaining our positivity. And the questions actually came from a number of individuals who disclosed that they were single parents. They found it particularly hard to remain positive as well as motivated. Any tips for that sort of individual? Maybe, again, Michael, this would be probably something that you're advising on quite commonly in your practice.
I am indeed. And look, I think it's to do with recognizing your self-talk. So we all have a little conversation in our head from the moment we get up in the morning till the moment we go to bed at night. And the tricky thing about self-talk is it almost always, no matter how biased or wrong, sounds like the truth. And I think what we have to do is we have to become the observer of our thoughts, because there's a tendency, particularly when there's an absence of information, when there's a lot of uncertainty, our minds can become like a fortune teller that only makes negative predictions. And we can easily flip into a sort of catastrophic narrative where we bombard ourselves with what if narratives. And I don't think that's helpful. So the trick is to become the observer of our thoughts and to name, to notice, and if you need some help, see a good psychologist, diffuse those thoughts. Because I think there is, particularly when you listen to the TV or the radio, there's this kind of negative news cycle, which I think can feed that negativity. So what am I suggesting? I'm suggesting that we consciously focus on the things that we can control. And I keep pointing out to my family, look, the vaccination rates are increasing. I'll open the age on my iPad and I'll take a picture of the little vaccination tracker that they've got there every morning. And I'll take a screenshot of that and I'll send it out to my family, reminding them that there will be a time when we will have less restrictions, that our response to the pandemic so far has been pretty good. We're lucky we live in a country like Australia with a pretty fantastic healthcare system, actually, and that we are headed towards a pretty good outcome, and that the government didn't get it right to begin with. There's not much point in spending all your time in character assassination of our federal and state leaders, which is pretty common in the media, but rather we should basically recognize that everyone's human. There was no playbook for this, and be a bit more forgiving. David?
No, I don't have much to add to that, Michael, because I think that's really important. I think that glass half full mentality rather than the glass half empty, and something I've talked about actually for a very long time, not just during the pandemic, with staff at work, is we're all really good at problem finding. But actually, we can all be really good at problem solving. And so if we actually flip that attitude around and we flip around to thinking, as you say, what can we change? What are the things that we can actually do to take those little steps? Then I think that starts to bring in the optimism. And I think optimism is something that's easy to lose, but hopefully it's something that we can all get back without too much too much trouble. And as you said earlier, I'm big on creativity, but I'm also big on activity. And actually, creativity and activity are two of the things that really make things better. But the other parts are keep learning, not just about school, but keep learning, keep moving forward in how we see things, and also taking notice of all the positive things. I was driving to the supermarket yesterday and suddenly noticed that where I live, all the daisies were out. The white daisies, lovely yellow middles. Just those little things. Spring's coming. It's the weather's going to change. My wife was saying to me, "Gosh, I don't have to put the heater on. I might actually have to put the air conditioning on." Thinking about those positives that we can't necessarily change, but are going to take us along with them.
Yeah, and I'll refer you again to this lovely white beam of sunlight that's zooming into my room here. That makes me feel very good. There were some other themes. I want to move on to them. One was around screen time. And in the interest of time, what I would do is refer people, and we'll put the link in for this, to our previous panel discussion that explored screen time in quite a bit of depth. I think that was an excellent discussion around that, would be quite helpful for people that are tuned into this particular webinar. But I will then move on to a different theme, and this, David, I think is very much within your territory. We had some interesting questions about attention deficit hyperactivity disorder, or ADHD. So what about people with ADHD? Have they had it harder during the lockdown?
I think many of them have had it very hard. I wouldn't want to presume that they have all had it harder. Some have done better than others. But as a group, it's been very challenging. It's been very challenging because lockdown actually really challenges the core parts of them, their difficulty concentrating and focusing, their impulsivity, their overactivity. Really experiencing that during lockdown has been very, very challenging. We were, however, aware that this was going to be an issue with colleagues at the Australian ADHD Professionals Association. And again, we'll share the link for ADPA, as it's known, with this. We developed some tips, first to help parents support children during the pandemic, and also some tips for clinicians, or guidelines for clinicians. I was lucky enough to be involved in international discussions about this. And what was great was that everybody was on the same page. The first thing we feel is important is that it's important to continue. If your child's on ADHD medication, it was important to continue on that medication. And actually, rather than needing lower doses of medication, sometimes what the pandemic and the lockdowns actually identified was that children's ADHD wasn't as well managed as parents might have thought it was. And although it was a rude awakening in some ways, a lot of parents have said, I didn't realize how much difficulty my child had until I was with them 24/7. I now have a different understanding of how difficult it is for them to manage in school. So keeping the ADHD medication going, and again, consulting with your doctor if you think that actually maybe needs adjusting. Probably more than other kids, helping the kid with ADHD, the children, young people with ADHD, to maintain a regular daily routine. For them, routine is not something that comes naturally. It's something that really has to be worked at. They also need a routine that's broken down into small, easy, bite-sized chunks. You can't say, okay, this is the morning, 9 till 12, you're doing online school. That's one routine, but they're going to need much more frequent breaks from that, and you probably need to timetable them differently often than other kids within the class. And that would obviously be something to discuss with the teacher where appropriate, but to think about that. Focusing on positives rather than negatives. People with ADHD actually respond much, much better to positive rewards. Everybody responds better to positive rewards, but actually kids with ADHD, people with ADHD need those positive rewards much quicker, because their link between the behavior that's happened and the reward that they get lasts much shorter time. So you need to reward really almost immediately, but also helping them to identify the things that they do well and to build on those. As with any other kid, though, they're going to get anxieties, they're going to get worries. And so encouraging them to talk about these. It's no different from all children, but their worries might be different and their worries might be more intense. And acting proactively. Act before they get bored. Learn about your child. Learn about how long their concentration span or their stick-to-itiveness span is, and step in early, preempt it before they start to get bored. That can actually help them to diffuse a lot of the angst and irritability that will often come up, not just for the child, but for those around them. And so all of those tips are actually there with a lot more explanation on the ADPA website. So I would encourage people with a child with ADHD, if they're struggling, to have a look at those.
Thank you. And we must provide those links when this goes out. Thanks for that answer, David. That was very much in your area of expertise. I want to acknowledge that. The next theme, though, the theme again, just to remind everyone, was based around a number of sort of related questions. The next theme I want to move on to is on the topic of grief. Now, thankfully, we haven't had many sort of nasty situations from COVID where people have actually died. But the conversation here was more around the grief that are felt by children in not being able to visit freely their relatives, particularly, for example, their grandparents, etc. So, Michael, any advice on or any information that you have around grief in young people and how they can sort of manage these feelings?
Yeah, I mean, I think a lot of this is disappointment. And I think that this is the first time we've actually asked this generation to make some really significant personal sacrifices of their freedom and autonomy for the greater good. And I think that they were accustomed to basically pretty much having a smooth kind of ride. And while my father's generation, being an RAF pilot and being in Bomber Command, they had a much greater appreciation of the impact of kind of disruption. So I think that a lot of this is helping kids manage the disappointment, and David's articulated beautifully the loss of the rites of passage, the really important things like having a formal, being able to get your license. All of these things have been put on hold. So I think when we're dealing with both children and adolescents with disappointment, I think it's really important to ask them to tell us how they feel. If they haven't articulated it correctly, I think our job as parents is to use phrases like, help me understand a little bit more about that. Once they've told you, my practice is then to paraphrase it back to them to make sure that we have actually understood the depth and breadth of what it is that they are feeling, and to feed that back to them. And they'll either correct you or go, no, you've got it. Then I think our job is to try and recontextualize this, to reframe it. I've always believed the great message for young people is if you can't change something, you can always change the way you think about it. And I think our job as adults with 100 billion brain cells and 1,000 trillion connections that are all wired up, that's our job. Kids are great imitators. Let's give them something wonderful to imitate. And I think while we can recontextualize it because we've got that life experience, what we try and avoid is allowing them to marinate in that disappointment. So if it is normal and healthy to feel and express intense and painful emotions when you're grieving a significant loss. And there are a range of feelings, and we need to be conscious of that and not at all restrictive. I don't think that grief is linear. I think it's a chaotic, all over the shop experience. But I think expressions of grief help these young people learn how to live with loss. And the great news is that the painful feelings, in my experience, decrease in intensity over time if the young person has received the kind of compassionate support that is right for them. David.
Yeah, I was thinking, Michael, as you were talking there, one group that we haven't really been able to consider, and neither you nor I guess, have expertise in that area, is those who have come to this country from other places, so immigrant communities, but also those who haven't, those in the Indigenous and Aboriginal communities, whose sense of family and sense of self is very, very different. And it just gave me a bit of a jolt, actually, to think about how loss is being experienced in those communities. Sarath and I know from experience within the university that a lot of our students come from overseas, and a lot of them have been dislocated from their family and dislocated into a culture that's not theirs, and that has been very challenging. So it just made me think about grief, and probably some of the real grief of not being able to visit a relative who, not through COVID necessarily, but who has become sick or has passed away. And I certainly have colleagues for whom that's been very difficult. And these are grown-up adults, professionals, most of them mental health professionals. And I know how challenging it's been for them, making me think about how challenging that will be for others. So that probably is an area where, as a society, we've still got quite a lot of work to do.
Yeah, anything more on that, Michael, before we move to some of our last themes?
No, I agree. I think the key is to allow young people to express their disappointment and grief. And I think there's a little bit of a tendency, certainly in Anglo-Saxon Australia, to do the whole stiff upper lip, just let's carry on. And I think that's unhelpful at this stage. I think we do need to encourage people to share their thoughts and feelings.
Yeah, I agree.
Great. The next theme is around bullying. Now, obviously, that is an issue at the best of times. First of all, and either of you, I think, could probably contribute to this. Would we expect that bullying could increase during lockdowns? And secondly, do you have any advice on actually how to manage bullying in a sort of family situation? Perhaps, maybe Michael, could you start on that?
Sure. Well, we know from the reports to Julie Inman-Grant, the E-Safety Commissioner, that in fact reports to the E-Safety Commission have substantially increased during lockdown, particularly of cyber bullying, which is entirely unsurprising since we've already articulated the fact that they're online much more than ever before. I think, to me, this is really about teaching young people how to use the internet in a safe, smart and responsible way. And that is that they should know way before it happens that people are unpleasant to one another online, that that's not okay, that when it happens, they are to block the individual, save the evidence, tell an adult, and that the adult has a responsibility to, particularly if it's school related, and it tends to be, to let the school know. Now, the law states very clearly that the schools have an obligation to provide young people with a safe environment in which to learn. That is both on and offline. There is a law, I'm not a lawyer, but I happen to know the law, which is section 47417 of the Commonwealth Criminal Code, which states that it is an offence to use a carriage service, which is the rather quaint way our legal colleagues refer to the internet, to menace, harass or cause offence. And of course, the Victoria Police can and do charge under Commonwealth law, and there are various state statutes as well. So while I'm not advocating that we go around prosecuting every young person who says something stupid online, I do think we need to draw a line in the sand around this behaviour. We've seen some disastrous outcomes from unchecked bullying. So I think the answer lies in education. And I would propose something, and that is that Google have created something called a digital license. And you'll probably remember from school that they used to have a pen license, and you sort of would graduate to that. The good people at Google have created this online digital license, which young people in primary school, lower primary, upper primary, and lower secondary can in fact sit, and it's designed to give them the skills and the knowledge and the strategies to enable them to manage these situations when they arise. And that's certainly something that we could do while we're in lockdown. Those licenses are pretty straightforward. I think they cost about $10, and it's a very fruitful investment in your child's online experience.
Well, thanks. I actually hadn't heard of those before. Very interesting. We should certainly look into those. David, any comments on what Michael's said there?
Yeah, no, all supportive again. But the other thing I found when I was doing my own little bit of research for this question, because I hadn't worked in bullying for a while, was actually the Victorian government's Bully Stoppers program, which I thought had some very good advice on it. The advice I first picked up on was what doesn't work, and actually it's important to know what doesn't work. And there are two types of thing that doesn't work. Fighting back and bullying the bully isn't going to work, but also ignoring it, walking away and just going to play with others and being silent about the program, about the problem isn't going to work. So I think one of the things that we need to do is to empower young people, one, to report bullying, but then to be supportive when they do. And that again is something that parents and schools can do. And to be honest, it's something that isn't always done well. And so I think it's not just the young people that need to be able to know what to do, but our professionals also need to be able to make sure that they respond accurately to the bullying.
Thanks, David. Michael, were you doing some push-ups on the floor following the exercise advice there?
No, I just had to plug my phone in. I do beg your pardon, Sarah.
That's okay. Look, the last thing I want to ask each of you really is to reflect on the panel discussion that we had previously. The myriad questions that were put in the Q&A, the general nature of the themes that we've tried to tackle today. They're difficult themes. I think you've both done fantastically well, really testimony to your training in your respective areas of psychiatry and psychology as well. But perhaps just the last thing then, and David, perhaps you could go first. Could you just comment on these themes? Are they the sort of themes that you're experiencing in your day-to-day practice? Do you think that some of the practical things that you've mentioned can be readily adopted by people that happen to be watching this today?
Well, I think more important, they are what I see in my day-to-day practice with my own clients, but actually they're also what I see in my day-to-day life. So when I go out and I talk with other families, when I'm discussing with my own daughter what's happening. And so I think you're right, that these are the kind of things, yes, that Michael and I know about because we work in professional practice. But actually everything we've talked about is something that, or are things that can be put into place within families. They don't necessarily need Michael or I to be able to do them. And I think that's been the real success of having these discussions. It also was great to hear, and again, not all of the things we had in the questions were negative. There were also people sharing tips, things that they'd found to be helpful with others, and I saw that some of those were picked up. So yes, these are really genuine issues and difficulties. But as you know, and you and I have talked about this, I think that we must be optimistic. We mustn't catastrophize what's going on. The big statistic that stuck in my mind when I was, again, doing some preparatory work for this was that 85% of kids say that they feel they've coped pretty well. Now, that means there's a lot of kids that aren't coping well, but there are a lot of kids who are. And hopefully those kids, those families will also be able to help their peers out. But for those who aren't coping well, hopefully the resources that we've given, the discussions that we've had are going to help them to find ways to cope better. And I think helping our children to thrive out of lockdown, not just survive, is the message that we really want.
Yeah, great finishing comment from you, David. And Michael, privilege for you to fire the last comments.
Sure. Look, I agree with what David has said. I think if you can take anything away from this, it's the importance of acknowledging and validating how people are feeling at the moment, to remind them that they're not alone, to be understanding and reassuring, to seek out those uplifting activities. To the antidote, I think, very much to languishing is that state of flow where you lose yourself in something that you really love doing. And it might be reading a good book or binging on Netflix. And to remember above all that the best view comes after the hardest climb. And we're on one now, but things will, as they say, it's always darkest before the dawn. We've got a dawn and it's coming.
Look, on that, thank you very much. That was a fantastic way to finish this discussion. Really grateful to both of you, Professor David Coghill and Professor Michael Carr-Gregg. I think your responses to the difficult themes that we've been discussing today have been really helpful and fantastic. I've personally found them very interesting. Many of the tips I think I'm going to put into my own family and my own life practice. Just to summarize what we've been doing here, we had over 100 questions that were posed to us, and we were unable to answer each of those questions. So we've generated these themes, and I hope that the great responses today are going to be helpful in your own lives in trying to manage some of these very difficult things that you've posed to us. So on that note, thank you both, and thank you all for listening. It's been a real pleasure, and I hope you've enjoyed this supplement to our original panel discussion. All the best. Bye-bye.